I got nightmares in my head, I fear. Thoughts build up until I can't feel. My mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper. I got nightmares in my head, I fear.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. So, as you've seen, new videos emerged of the Trump shooter Thomas Crooks' father. It's difficult not to look at this brief snippet without getting a sense of Thomas Crooks himself, like father, like son. Just that grey, colourless, weighted grimness of his life. The Mail Online, meanwhile, has published one of the most meaningful analyses I've seen, with psychological experts weighing in, and it's also chock full of statistics. It ought to be filled with insight, but as usual, even with the right experts on the job, no one really seems to know what they're dealing with here. And so I'm going to take you through some of the stats that are worth something and some of what the expert statements that are really insightful. Before we get to that, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. Bear in mind, as I've said before, I've written books on these sorts of characters, these sorts of personalities. And you might say, okay, so well done, you wrote a book, well done. I think one way to test that is to say, what is the right way to approach a case like this? So an incident like this happens, what's the right approach? Now, I've seen some of my fellow YouTubers basically going along the default setting, which is criticize the police, criticize law enforcement, fire the head of security, the security chief, and that's kind of like putting band-aids over something after it's happened. And you might say, no, I think it's really a good idea, hold the police responsible kind of thing. And I think that is totally an asinine way of approaching it. And it's interesting that some of these channels that are so critical are law enforcement channels themselves. So my approach is totally different, which is looking at the source of the problem, not the end result, not trying to plug holes in the end result, not trying to have like policing. It's like you don't do anything about the underlying condition. You just try and put up a wall or bandage it up or have like an army of police that are going to somehow sort out the problem. No, the problem is you've got an army of other people that are coming up out of the woodwork. Why is that? What is the source code for what is creating these disenfranchised young men? And let me ask you, which approach do you think is better? That you have these individuals arise because of a soil, a psychological soil, a cultural fabric that is creating unhappy, aggressive young men, right? Or do you think the approach is you just let that happen and you just try and build up an army of law enforcement that are now supposed to deal with this? Which approach do you think is better? And so I think that is the difference between someone who's written a book about it and someone who just comes into it like a YouTuber and says, oh, I don't like how law enforcement dealt with this. And so in this video, we once again going to go through this difficult territory of trying to find out who this person is, why he's behaving the way he is, and how we can maybe solve this problem from the position of the source of the problem. What makes these individuals who they are, right? Do you agree with that? And so if you find this analysis worthwhile, please like, share, leave a comment. You can also read my book, Slaughter. It's on Amazon. You can read my book. I'll put a link to that in the description. You can also hit the thanks button, and let's get started. Now, according to the Mail Online, it repeats that whole thing. There's no concrete motive that has been established. Thomas Crooks' internet history revealed he searched for information about major depressive disorder in the days leading up to the attack on July 13. According to the Mail Online, psychologists say the condition, a clinical term to describe depression, can last a long time and affects everyday life. It's typically marked by hatred of oneself. Now, if you had to guess, where would you say Thomas's hatred comes from? Do you think he was born and he just sort of lived his life and then one day woke up and he hated himself? And that's, again, where does this sense of being alienated come from in our culture? I mean, let's assume there's hatred to begin with. Do you think it sort of rained on him, like this whole self-hatred rained on him by a random cloud? It rained on him and only on him, not on the guy next to him. Or do you think maybe he stumbled onto the self-hatred? Maybe he banged his head on a rock and when he opened his eyes, he suddenly hated himself. Or do you think he ate bad pizza?
No. Let me tell you what I believe.
That hatred is there, all right, but it's a self-defeating, loathsome, hopeless kind of hatred, something that doesn't emerge in a vacuum. It's a long process of diminishing self-esteem. It comes from dozens of voices repeating the same negative, diminishing, emasculating narrative hour after hour, day after day, during those crucial formative years when someone is 13, 14, 15 years old, when someone's confidence is supposed to be building, while instead what is happening, it's breaking, it's been stripped away. And until eventually who he was reduced to a mantra, someone else's sort of mocking saying to him, words to him. And what happens? Words become thoughts. Thoughts, when you're alone with them for long enough, eventually become seeds forming in the dark, moist, chocolatey psychological soils, and those seeds finally begin to germinate. Crooks's depression flowed from his sense of insignificance. Insignificance is tough to deal with, but it's especially tough when a young person is supposed to be emerging, individuating into his life, but instead finds himself hiding from it, defeated instead by it. All of those words, like arrows, make internal injuries, leave behind internal psychological scars. Now, you might say, wow, I was bullied, none of this happened to me. Wow, I went to high school, nothing happened to me. I know hundreds of people, didn't happen to me. This isn't about you or the people that it didn't happen to. This is about someone who's more sensitive than what you are, someone who was scarred in a way that you weren't, right? And although you may scoff at that notion and maybe you think it's ridiculous, there are people, believe it or not, there are people in the world that are a bit more sensitive than what you are. There are people who, when they are humiliated, it does actually affect them, even though it might not affect you. According to the Mail Online, quote, it can also be turned outward. Depressed people are around 3 times more likely to carry out a violent crime, some research shows. And that's a little interesting thing of saying, do you notice any people that are depressed around you? You might actually want to help them out. You might want to say a kind word to them instead of the opposite. It might actually be good for your neighborhood or your society to reach out to someone who doesn't look very happy instead of the opposite, criticize them, make fun of them, etc. At least a quarter of mass shooters in the US are clinically depressed or have other non-psychotic mental illnesses. At least a quarter. Now, there is a useful statistic. This is what is missing around so much of the analysis around shooters. They aren't just depressed, they are depressed to the point that they no longer wish to live, right? So we're not just talking about someone who's sad, we're talking about someone who is so unhappy that they've given up on life. And they are going through the S word that rhymes with homicidal. The Mail Online goes on to note, the prospect that Crooks may have been depressed and taking antidepressants has reignited a debate in the medical world. Do those drugs in fact play a role in creating homicidal tendencies? Now, normally I don't like conversations around this topic that automatically defaults to mental illness or that blames drugs or disorders. But I think given that both of Thomas Crooks's parents are counselors, and given that he seemed to diagnose himself with major depressive disorder, and given that if his parents were both counselors, they probably would have recommended antidepressants, I do think it's relevant. I think it's more relevant than usual. Can I just say that looking at Crooks's dad, this is just my own opinion, and I don't think it's unfair to say he appears quite overweight. I personally would have reservations about giving mental health advice. My advice, if you have depression, my first word of advice would be to try exercising. And I can't imagine Thomas's father saying that. He certainly isn't living it himself. Now, according to the Mail Online, law enforcement do not know why Crooks targeted Trump, and the shooter's politics appear confused. Dr. Craig Hands, a clinical psychologist in California, told Daily Mail, quote, in the case of a shooter, I can only surmise in many ways from what I've heard, he fits a common profile. Indeed, it may be likely, I don't know that he was depressed, but that may have contributed to his actions. Well, of course it did. Of course it did. It's also interesting that compared to the Washington Post, which simply couldn't find a profile, and that is in terms of an assassin profile, there is a shooter profile. And that is the difference here. We're not dealing with an assassin here as much as people want him to be an assassin. We're actually dealing with something else. He also wasn't using the kind of weapon you would use for that kind of thing. He was using the typical weapon used in by these shooters. Crooks fits that profile perfectly. The depression and isolation also fits the profile perfectly. According to the Mail Online, quote, this depression creates isolation. There's kind of a burning ember kind of depression that's associated with internal rage against oneself and rage against the machine, as it were, rage against the world. Where do you think that rage came from, the rage against the world? It came from the rage from the world basically being foisted on this individual over and over again in the classroom, right? Also, this burning ember kind of depression is something that burns for a very long time. It didn't just happen one day that he woke up. It's something that has been burning at him for a long, long period of time. What do you think was also burning at him for a long, long time? Well, bullying at school often goes on for years, not just a day or a week or months. It goes on for years.
You have made me very desperate. You might not be glad that you did. Ooh. It burns you to have come so close.
So how is he isolated to begin with? Well, he's isolated by his peers. He's mocked, he's humiliated, he's told he's not good enough. He doesn't fit into the status quo. He's not cool. That is reinforced over and over again. So that's where the isolation starts. The isolation then leads to depression, and the depression then exacerbates the isolation. According to the article, major depressive disorder is a clinical diagnosis that causes a persistent feeling of deep sadness, hopelessness, loss in interest in activities, low energy, poor or increased appetite, concentration changes, not wanting to live, ideations, and behavior. Now, I think it's clear how you can go into that situation. How can you get out of it? That's a conversation you don't really hear about very much. I've already provided one suggestion. Exercise. Spend time on your own, building up your body, building up your sense of motivation, all that kind of thing. Now, what do you think the relatively benign sounding not wanting to live ideations are all about? Well, we know that Lanza, Crumbly, and probably Crooks had them as well, even Stephen Paddock. These are crushed in individuals. They are so crushed in that their fantasies involve a kind of completely unadulterated lashing out. From being passive, pathetic, and flattened by the world, they want to explode outwards. They want to live. And this is the fuel of their fantasy worlds. You hear a lot of this spoken about in Stephen King books, and also, funny enough, deals with the same thing. Bullied kids in a high school kind of setting. Going back to the article, Dr. Hans added, typically the depression is criticism and rage towards oneself, self-hatred. Yes, but where does it come from? Dr. Hans goes on to say, I have to underscore the term hatred for oneself, but oftentimes or sometimes that hatred gets projected out externally. Of course, someone projected hatred onto this person who has now internalized it to the point that it's reached a maximum threshold. The point where this negativity is almost like a black hole. Now its gravity and darkness start to affect the space around it. Mail Online turned to statistics to make its point. Quote, a 2015 Oxford University study of about 47,000 people in Sweden both with and without depression, found that those with depression were about 3 times more likely than the general population to commit a violent crime, such as homicide, aggravated assault, or robbery. If you just think about this, if you want to deal with criminality, just in general, in the world, if you want to bring down the numbers of crimes, you might want to look at the depressed people around you and try to help them. Dr. Rachel Tollers, a licensed clinical psychologist based in California who specializes in the study of violent criminals, told Daily Mail that Crooks may have been seeking to kill the most visible people on the planet to make up for the fact that he felt invisible all of his life. This is exactly what we're talking about here. It's correct. The central issue here is insignificance. And you might not think it's a big deal to you, but actually it's the biggest deal when you're 17, 18, 19, 20 years old. It's then that your potency and agency is challenged and called into question by the world, and when one is supposed to step forward and prove oneself. But what if you've been stripped of all your self-worth and self-esteem, and instead of stepping forward, you're withdrawing? Instead of stepping forward, you find the world terrifying and frightening. Instead of finding the world this place that of opportunity and this almost like a playground where you can have fun, it's something that you fear. Instead of jumping into life with all the gusto of youth, you're depressed, you're anxious, you've got no psychological resources, no character armor, no hope. Nothing in which to step, nothing which you can use to, clothe yourself, to step into the terrifying footless halls that constitute the unknown. And so in a psychological sense, Crooks is doing what Jay Slater did. You're going into hostile terrain without the right preparation, and what is likely to happen? You're going to fall. You're going to fall when the terrain becomes too treacherous. Professor Peter Gotcha, a medical researcher and co-founder of the famous Cochrane Collaboration, an evidence-based research institution in the UK, floated the idea that medication could have played a role. He said that it's quite possible that he was taking a depression drug, which we know can increase the risk of homicide as well. Now, once again, I don't like or agree with the idea. I mean, the drug didn't pull the trigger here. But I do think antidepressants can actually aid and abet with this whole notion of numbness and disconnection that a person with depression may feel. Antidepressants also allow a person a route to remaining passive, a route to staying timid or faint-hearted, in the sense that what has to be learned is how to deal with the world, is how to do something, how to act. And instead of that idea, they're not given an opportunity or an alternative to do so. Instead, you take a pill, which basically says, don't do anything, just do this, let everything else stay the same, and you'll feel better. That's not the solution. So the stats surrounding this are a mixed bag. Some stats show that these drugs are good in terms of mitigating violent behavior, while others seem to demonstrate the potential to aggravate violent feelings. So some studies do show a link between antidepressants and violent behaviors. I'm not going to take it further than that, but if you want me to continue this analysis, it's certainly, I think, important. Let me know in the comments and we'll do a part 2 to this important subject. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.